The hum of the projector filled the dimly lit briefing room, its pale light washing over the map of Helmand Province, spread across the far wall. It was still well before dawn at Forward Operating Base Falcon, and the air inside carried the faint smell of dust, stale coffee, and the ever-present tang of aviation fuel drifting in from the flight line. Captain Sarah Viperchun sat forward in her chair, her flight gloves resting in her lap, the soft leather creased from years of use. The mission folder lay open on the table in front of her. Satellite photographs printed in perfect clarity. Every wall and rooftop in the compound showed with crisp definition. Even the surrounding terrain looked almost staged, without so much as a stray goat or vehicle to interrupt the image. It was the kind of intelligence product that was meant to inspire confidence, but to her, it felt like a warning. Across from her, two intelligence officers moved through the briefing, with the confidence of men certain their data was unassailable. One tapped a pen against the edge of the table as he outlined the objective. Navy SEAL Team, Trident 7, would infiltrate under cover of darkness and capture Halil Hakim, a Taliban commander responsible for a recent surge of improvised explosive device attacks in the region. Multiple human sources had confirmed his presence in the compound on the outskirts of Maria. The photographs, taken less than 12 hours earlier, showed minimal security. They called it a golden opportunity. The plan sounded clean, surgical, and fast. Sarah's gaze stayed fixed on the map, but she could feel the weight of the pitch pressing in. Something in her gut told her the picture was too neat. She leaned forward slightly, the tip of her pen tapping once against the table. It's rare for a high-value target to sit still in such an exposed location, she said evenly, and it's even rarer for them to be surrounded by so little visible security. One of the intel officers glanced up with the faintest trace of impatience. Multiple sources. Captain, cross-verified. Satellite coverage is as recent as we can get. We've run this through every channel. His tone carried the edge of someone confident their numbers could not be wrong. The other officer gave a small, tight smile, as if to reassure her, but it landed short of convincing. Sarah nodded once, keeping her thoughts to herself. She had been in the air long enough to know that operations built on perfect intelligence rarely stayed perfect when boots hit the ground. But the clock on the far wall ticked forward, each second bringing them closer to launch. And her place was not to win this argument, but to be ready when things went sideways. From her right, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez caught her eye. He said nothing, but the slight arch of his brow and the way his hand rested loosely on the edge of his own folder told her he had caught the same scent she had. Over the past months, they had flown dozens of missions together, long enough for her to recognize the subtle cues in his expression. He was ready to back her play if the mission turned ugly. The rest of the briefing moved briskly, the officers clicking through slides and confirming times, frequencies, and rules of engagement. Rodriguez asked a question about possible ridgeline positions near the compound, his voice calm but deliberate. The answer came back quick. No heat signatures. No signs of occupancy. Sarah made a note in the margin of her folder anyway. As the lights came up, the rustle of papers and muted scrape of chairs filled the room. She closed the mission folder with a soft snap and slipped her gloves into the crook of her arm. Outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to pale. The Apache sat on the tarmac, its twin turbines quiet for now, but the faint smell of oil and metal carried on the cool air. In a few minutes, she and Rodriguez would be climbing into that cockpit, trusting each other more than the polished images in the folder. The clock kept ticking, steady as a heartbeat, marking the moments before the first rotor blade would turn. The Apache lifted from the tarmac in a shudder of controlled power, its twin turbine spooling into a steady hum that vibrated up through the seat and into Sarah Viperchun's spine. The world outside the canopy was a vast, dark expanse, broken only by the ghostly green tint of her night vision goggles. Helmand Province stretched out below in jagged silhouettes. The terrain, a mix of ridges, ravines, and scattered clusters of mud brick buildings, The pre-dawn air was still and cold, the kind of silence that sharpened every sound inside the cockpit, the faint click of switches, the hum of avionics, the occasional crackle of radio static. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez sat to her right, his night vision lenses reflecting a muted emerald glow as he scanned the ground through the thermal imaging system. His voice was calm, but keyed with focus when he spoke. Trident 7. This is Viper. We are airborne and on station. Following your insertion route to the target. The reply came quick from Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, his voice steady, despite being 47 minutes into a stealth movement through hostile territory. Copy. Viper. We're 2 minutes from entry. Approaching target building now. Sarah's gloved hands moved across the controls, making minor adjustments to heading and altitude. The heads-up display floated in her field of view, clean numbers and compass bearings, marking their path toward the village of Maria. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the compound outline on the mission map clipped to her knee, then back to the terrain below. On thermal. The target building was a solid block of cool darkness. No heat signatures moved inside or around it. For now, Rodriguez broke the quiet. Movement. Perimeter east. His tone was different now, still calm, but tighter. Sarah shifted to the thermal screen in front of her and saw it faint white smudges. Heat blooms against the cooler earth. Moving fast. How many, she asked. 3? No? 5. Pickup trucks. Coming in from the east at speed. He adjusted the magnification, his fingers tightening slightly on the weapon controls. Make that more. We've got additional movement from the north and south. I'm counting at least a dozen vehicles total, all converging on the compound. A cold weight settled in Sarah's chest. This was the exact scenario she had feared during the briefing. She keyed the radio. Trident 7. Abort. You have multiple vehicles inbound from all directions. This is a trap. The pause on the other end was brief but telling. Copy. Viper. Morrison replied, his voice still even. We're already inside. 30 seconds to clear target. Sarah could see the truth unfolding on her thermal display. The trucks were racing across open ground, with disciplined spacing, their heat signatures flaring bright against the desert floor. It wasn't random movement, it was coordinated. She could even make out the long, narrow shapes mounted in some of the beds, the telltale glow of heavy weapons heating under idling engines. She adjusted their orbit, banking the Apache in a slow, deliberate circle to keep the compound in sight while maintaining altitude. Her flight gloves creaked as her grip shifted on the cyclic. Her eyes flicking from the terrain to the threat indicators on her display. Rodriguez worked in sync beside her, scanning for additional contacts, his free hand resting lightly near the trigger detents. Below, the compound on the mission map had been the goal, the neat red outline promising a clean objective. Now it was just a marker for an operation already unraveling. Through the thermal scope, it looked like an island about to be swallowed by a fast-moving tide. The green light of the NVGs and the stark white of the thermal feed told a story no briefing room could have prepared them for. Danger had been in the air, from the moment they lifted off. Now it was coming into focus. And the SEALs were in the middle of it. The first of the pickup trucks skidded to a halt in a plume of dust, its heat signature flaring bright on Sarah Viperchun's thermal display. The rest followed in disciplined arcs. Encircling the compound with mechanical precision, she counted each arrival automatically. 8, 9, 10, then 14 in total. Doors swung open, and armed fighters spilled into the open, their silhouettes glowing white-hot in the scope as they fanned out to prepared firing positions. Heavy machine guns were swung into place, recoilless rifles lifted onto tripods, and RPG gunners knelt with launchers already shouldered. On the ridgelines beyond, smaller signatures settled prone, perfectly spaced snipers, taking their shots before the fight even began. Inside the compound, Morrison's voice cut in through the headset, calm, but edged with frustration. Viper. Target's not here. Looks like he cleared out hours ago. We've got signs of recent activity, but no Hakim. Sarah's stomach tightened. This was no missed opportunity. This was bait. Copy, she replied. This was a setup from the start. The silence on the channel was broken only by the sound of automatic weapons fire in the background. A hollow crackle over the radio that spoke of incoming rounds chewing through the building's walls. She switched her gaze between the thermal screen and the heads-up display, tracking enemy movement. The fighters moved like they'd rehearsed this 100 times, cutting off every possible escape route. Machine gun bursts flashed from the ridgelines, steady and precise. RPG trails burned through the night sky, each one leaving a fading streak before exploding against the compound's outer walls. Under the NVG glow, chunks of mud brick tore away in plumes of dust and debris. Rodriguez kept his voice even. We've got heavy fire north and south, recoilless rifles to the east. Ridge snipers are already bracketing the compound. They're sealing the box. The building itself was starting to come apart. Through the scope, Sarah watched rounds punch through the walls as if they were paper. Each impact, scattering white-hot shards across the thermal feed, the structure was losing integrity. And with every shot, the seal's protection dwindled. Extraction bird is 15 minutes out. She called over the net, already knowing it was too far. Marine QRF is 20. That's a long time in here. Morrison replied. The radio picked up the background of shouting and weapons fire before his voice returned, controlled but clipped. We can hold, but not without air keeping them back. Sarah knows the Apache lower. Rodriguez already selecting targets. They opened up with controlled bursts. The M230 chain gun walking fire across machine gun nests on the northern ridge, muzzle flashes winked out. But almost immediately, new ones flared to life from positions further along the slope. They're swapping out teams. Rodriguez observed, eyes locked on his thermal scope. Fresh shooters taking over as soon as we hit one position. Surface-to-air fire erupted in answer. RPGs angled up from the ground in tight arcs, forcing Sarah to break hard left. The Apache shuddering under the rapid maneuvers. Warning lights flickered on the console. Nothing critical yet. But every system was under strain. She circled back in place, using terrain to mask their approach before popping up to engage again. This time, return fire came heavier, sharper, almost as if the gunners were learning her patterns. She cut low and wide, but the tightening ring of enemy positions was unmistakable on the display, a white-hot halo closing around the seals. Dust clouds from the trucks hung in the air like a curtain, glowing faintly under the NVGs, a reminder of how fast the enemy had moved to seal this kill box. Every glance at her acquisition display was a study in inevitability. The circle was shrinking. The pressure building. Ambushes like this didn't happen by luck. They were built, fed with information, and executed with timing precise enough to catch even elite units off guard. From here, there was no breaking the ring, not yet. The only thing left was to hold the enemy back, second by second, until help arrived. If it arrived in time, Sarah shoved the cyclic forward and dropped the Apache to barely 50 feet above the compound, the ground rushing up until the rotor wash churned the dirt into a violent brown cloud. Dust and debris whipped through the enemy positions, blinding gunners and scattering fighters who had been braced against their weapons. For a few precious seconds, the compound disappeared inside the swirling haze. Friend and foe alike, silhouettes in a maelstrom. Rodriguez called targets through the storm, his voice steady. North Ridge. 3 machine gun nests in line. She swung the nose, her thumb pressing down on the trigger. The M230 chain gun roared, its buzzsaw rhythm sending high-explosive rounds walking across the ridge. Through the thermal sight, enemy signatures vanished in flashes of white heat as the nests went silent. The dust cloud hid her exact position, but she knew it would not last. A stronger position on the eastern slope came into view, a low stone wall braced with sandbags, muzzle flashes punching through gaps. Rodriguez lazed the target, and Sarah squeezed off a hellfire. The missile streaked forward, trailing a narrow flame, then detonated with a violent orange bloom that lit the valley and threw debris high into the air. The shock wave rippled through the cockpit, rattling the armored glass. The enemy responded instantly. RPG trails lanced upward from 3 directions, thin white lines cutting through the haze. Sarah threw the Apache into a hard climb, banking sharply to bleed speed while Rodriguez fired flares. 2 rockets spiraled off course, but the third passed close enough that its warhead blast slapped the fuselage, rocking them hard in the harnesses. More coming, Rodriguez varned. A 4th trail arced higher, this one steady, not wavering. The tone in her headset confirmed it. SAM launch. East Ridge. Sarah dropped the nose and rolled left, deploying chaff and flares in a spread. The missile's bright signature swerved, chasing the heat decoys, then burst in a white flash that peppered the tail boom with shrapnel. A metallic groan ran through the airframe, and the cockpit filled with the faint, acrid tang of hydraulic fluid. Primary hydraulics dropping, Rodriguez said, eyes on the instrument readout. Tail rotor authority compromised. She felt it immediately, the sluggish yaw response, the extra force needed on the pedals to hold line. The Apache wasn't broken, but every movement would now cost more effort, and each evasive turn would take longer to recover from. Still, she kept her orbit tight, refusing to pull back. The dust cloud was already thinning. The moment the enemy regained visibility, more fire poured in. Heavy machine gun rounds sparked against the armored skin. The impacts resonating through her seat, she kept moving, angling the nose down to rake another cluster of fighters on the western perimeter. Rodriguez's voice cut in again, the weight in it unmistakable. We're looking at over 60 shooters now, and I've got 2 more convoys coming from the south. This is escalating fast. Sarah scanned the thermal screen. The inbound vehicles were still distant but closing quickly, their engines hot and bright. The pattern was clear. They intended to overwhelm any hope of a breakout by sheer numbers. The hydraulic warning light glowed steadily on the panel, a reminder of the price they were already paying to stay in the fight. She pushed it from her mind. Pulling out now would mean leaving the SEALs to be overrun. The mission had shifted from supporting a capture to preventing a massacre. She steadied the helicopter, lining up another pass. The Apache shuddered under the strain, every maneuver slower than it should have been. But the line would hold for now because she was not about to break contact. Not while there were men still alive on the ground, counting on her to keep the circle from closing completely. The convoy from the south appeared first as a cluster of white-hot signatures on Sarah's thermal display, the shapes elongated by speed and framed by the wavering edge of her damaged sensor feed. Headlights sliced through the dust, bouncing with the uneven terrain. In the beds of the trucks, fighters braced themselves against the side rails, weapons already trained forward. She knew the moment they reached the perimeter, the SEAL's position would be completely choked off. "I'm taking the convoy," she said into the intercom, voice steady, despite the strain in her shoulders from fighting the damaged controls. "When they turn on me, Trident 7 moves." Rodriguez didn't question her. "Targets lased. You'll have about 20 seconds before the rest catch up." She pushed the Apache into a low, fast approach, the nose dipping toward the incoming wall of lights. Fire erupted from the lead trucks before she was within 100 yards. Tracer rounds and RPG trails streaking past in thin, lethal arcs. The cockpit rang with the snap of near misses, the muted thuds of impacts against armor. Her thumb pressed the Hellfire release, and the missile streaked ahead, cutting a bright line across the dark valley. It struck the second truck in the column, detonating its payload in a fireball that sent shrapnel scything into the vehicles around it. Fighters were thrown to the ground, their heat signatures tumbling in the thermal view. Without waiting for the dust to clear, she slewed the chain gun into line. The M230 chattered. High explosive shells tearing through engines, tires, and human silhouettes alike. The front of the convoy disintegrated under the barrage. A second Hellfire found its mark in the rearmost truck, trapping the remaining vehicles in a kill zone of flame and twisted steel. The explosions lit the valley in violent orange, shadows twisting across the cockpit. Rotor wash pulled smoke and embers upward, swirling them around the canopy. Secondary detonations from stored ammunition popped and flared, each one another distraction for the fighters now turning their weapons toward her instead of the compound. Convoy neutralized, Rodriguez reported, his tone even, but fast. You've got every gun in the south sector tracking you. The warning came just as a plume of white streaked upward from the chaos below. Sarah rolled hard right, but the RPG slammed into the tail boom before she could complete the maneuver. The Apache lurched, the airframe shuddering with the force of the blast. Red warning lights flooded the instrument panel, and the yaw control all but vanished. Her hands and feet worked instinctively, countering the spin with uneven pedal pressure and cyclic input. The tail rotor was still turning, but the vibration told her the damage was bad. She gritted her teeth and forced the helicopter level. Through the flicker of her thermal feed, she caught glimpses of movement inside the compound perimeter. 6 figures broke from the northeast corner. Sprinting low across open ground, the SEALs moved with discipline even under fire. Carrying their wounded and weaving between patches of cover, they disappeared into the outline of a larger, more intact building on the western edge. Trident 7 is in the new position. Morrison's voice came over the net, calm despite the chaos. Better cover here, but we're still boxed in. Sarah's eyes flicked to the ammunition count. 2 Hellfires remained, and just under 100 rounds in the chain gun. She had bought them a few moments, but not nearly enough to clear an extraction route. Dustoff's voice cut in. Static lacing. The transmission? Apache 7-7. LZ is still too hot. We've got multiple SAM teams lighting us up from the ridges. You'll need to clear them before we can even think about coming in. Smoke still drifted from the burning convoy below, the glow painting the cockpit in flickering light. It was a pyre and a lure, drawing the enemy's full attention in exactly the way she had intended. Every second they fired on her was another second the SEALs could fortify. Another moment, the circle didn't close completely. She steadied the aircraft, ignoring the tremor in the pedals and the groan of stressed metal. This was what buying time looked like, measured not in minutes, but in how long she could keep the enemy focused on her instead of the men pinned in that building. Rodriguez's voice was steady but grim as he read the numbers from his targeting display. 6 SAM teams spread across the ridgelines. 20 heavy weapons positions with perfect interlocking fields of fire. Sarah didn't need him to finish the thought. With 2 Hellfires and less than 100 rounds left, it was an impossible equation. No amount of skill could clear enough for a safe landing zone. Morrison's voice cut through the radio, carrying over the crack of gunfire. They were almost out of ammunition, down to sidearms. And Petty Officer Jackson was fading fast. His voice tightened when he said they had minutes at best before he bled out. Sarah's gaze flicked to the warning panel, the red hydraulic light flashing in rhythm with the pounding in her chest. Every system told her the same thing: stay in the air. Keep moving. Don't land here. She pushed the thought aside and made her decision. The protocols that kept pilots alive in hostile zones would get 6 men killed today. She keyed the mic, her voice calm and clipped. Prep your team. I'm putting down inside the wire. Rodriguez glanced over. Understanding instantly, he didn't argue. Instead, he began feeding her headings to minimize exposure on the approach. The Apache descended through swirling tracer fire, the rotor wash dragging dust and grit into a blinding halo around them. RPGs streaked past, some close enough to rattle the canopy with their shockwaves. The landing gear hit the dirt with a metallic groan, the whole frame shuddering under the impact. She kept the collective pulled, Engines spooled high. Rotors, slicing the air above them in a steady roar. The cockpit shook with every nearby detonation. Dust mixing with the acrid smell of burning fuel from the wrecks she had left behind minutes ago. The side door opened, and the SEALs appeared through the haze, running low and fast. Two of them carried Jackson between them, his weight sagging in their grip. Even from here, she could see the dark stains spreading across his uniform. The rest fanned out, firing short bursts to keep the enemy's heads down. Tracers cut bright lines through the air, some passing so close they lit the edges of the rotor arc. They reached the Apache in seconds that felt like hours. Rodriguez reached back, helping drag Jackson into the cramped passenger compartment not built for this many bodies. One man squeezed in after another, packs and rifles jamming against the bulkheads. Boots braced wherever they could find space. The compartment felt like it was swallowing them whole. Proof that when there was no other option, you made room. Morrison was last. He pivoted at the door, firing 2 final shots into the dust before swinging himself in. His boot hit the deck, and he slammed the door shut, shouting over the engines that they were all aboard. Sarah didn't wait. She pulled pitch hard, feeling the overloaded weight fight her lift. The rotors dug at the air, the hydraulic system groaning in protest, that red light still blinking in her peripheral vision. The Apache rose unevenly, climbing through fire from every direction. She flew by, coaxing the damaged bird into the sky with small, deliberate movements, keeping it balanced between too much and too little control. In the rear, the SEALs braced themselves against the bulkheads, one holding pressure on Jackson's wound, the others gripping whatever they could as the helicopter swayed and pitched. Up front, Sarah kept her focus locked ahead, her hands steady, despite the constant shudder of incoming fire passing close enough to hear. There was no victory in the moment, only survival measured in seconds. The compartment was full, the bird was heavy, and the fight was far from over. But everyone who was on the ground was now in the air. And that was the only number that mattered. The Apache clawed its way upward, every inch of altitude bought with the roar of overworked engines and the deep, labored thump of rotor blades straining under the load. Sarah kept her grip locked on the cyclic and collective, feeling every vibration and shudder through her gloves. The red hydraulic light stayed in the corner of her vision, steady and insistent, a reminder of how thin the margin was. An RPG streaked up from the valley floor, close enough that its exhaust fogged the windscreen in a white blur. She kept the climb steady, refusing to give the enemy the satisfaction of a panicked maneuver. Rodriguez kept scanning, eyes flicking between what little remained of the HUD and the broken fragments of targeting data still feeding through. Dustoff 31. Apache 77. Sarah called into the headset, her voice even despite the strain. The medevac pilot came back quick, giving her a grid 5 miles northwest of the compound. She confirmed and adjusted course, the bird answering sluggishly. The SEALs in the back were silent except for one murmured count on Jackson's breathing. Sarah didn't look back. Her job was ahead, and the Apache was making her work for every second of flight. The autopilot gave out first, the disconnect chime sounding almost casual in the chaos. Then the navigation computer blinked twice and died, the map display going black. She flew by the horizon. By instinct, and by Rodriguez's bearings, the first hint of dawn cut a pale line along the eastern mountains. As the medevac silhouette appeared ahead, Sarah eased closer, matching altitude in a slow, deliberate drift until the 2 helicopters held position in the same stretch of turbulent air. Rotor wash from the dust-off buffeted them hard, and she worked the controls in short, sharp corrections. Rodriguez slid the side panel open, and the medevac crew moved in. Jackson was passed out cold, but they worked fast, hands and straps moving in perfect coordination. The gap between aircraft was no more than a few feet, the 2 machines holding steady like dancers, locked in a dangerous step. The moment Jackson was secured in the medevac cabin, The dust-off peeled away toward the field hospital, its rotors thumping into the distance. Sarah turned the Apache toward home. The dawn light made the valley floor clearer, but the cockpit felt darker, as one by one the HUD elements winked out. All that remained were the warning lights, glowing in red and amber. The heartbeat of a bird being kept alive by will alone. Rodriguez checked their stores, 2 Hellfires still armed, and they both knew she'd keep them ready until they touched down. Every mile back to base was flown by hand, without the boost systems that made the controls manageable. Sarah's arms ached, her shoulders burning from the constant corrections to keep them level in the morning wind. The SEALs rode in silence, braced against each other in the cramped space, their rifles still in reach. The engines held, the rotors kept their rhythm, and the Apache stayed in the air. She didn't think about how close it all was to coming apart. She thought about the landing, about holding everything together until they crossed the wire. That was the job. That was the only way home. The base perimeter came into view just as the first engine flamed out, the sudden drop in thrust pulling at the Apache like an anchor. Sarah kept her voice steady, calling out airspeed and descent to Rodriguez even as the second engine coughed and died. The rotor blades bit into the air on momentum alone, the heavy frame sinking toward the runway. She coaxed every last turn from them, easing into autorotation, trading altitude for rotor speed in a final push to make the strip. The bird hit hard, skidding across the tarmac in a trail of sparks and dust. The metallic groan of the rotor mast echoed over the airfield as the blades slowed, each turn rougher than the last until they stopped entirely. The dust haze hung in the air, coating her visor, the cockpit smelling of hot oil and scorched metal. She powered down what was left of the systems and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. The SEALs moved first, the passenger hatch opening to the crunch of boots on gravel. A few stepped past her window without a word. Others touched her shoulder briefly in passing, nothing elaborate, just enough to speak for what they all knew. Morrison was last, his glance steady as he climbed down. He gave a short nod before walking toward the medics. 6 months later, the mission had a different weight. Intel pulled from the failed operation had led to the capture of 3 Taliban commanders and the disruption of a major IED network. The cost was still clear in her mind, but the results were undeniable. The day of the medal ceremony was bright and windless, the parade ground filled with uniforms and murmured conversation. The Distinguished Flying Cross hung in the air for a moment before the general pinned it to her uniform. The sunlight caught on its edges, throwing a sharp gleam across the line of attending SEALs. All 6 were there, standing together, their expressions steady. When the formality ended, Morrison found her away from the crowd. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "You brought us home, Viper." There was no flourish in it, no need for more. She met his gaze and let the words settle where the medal never could. Far from the ceremony, in the cold shadow of the mountains, the wreckage of her Apache still lay where it fell after the recovery team stripped what they could. The paint had faded, the fuselage weathered by sun and wind, but its frame remained. In that still place, it stood not as a ruin, but as proof of a fight survived, of a promise kept, of the difference between if and when.